Now, Canadian-born Mark Steyn is one of the world's best-known conservative commentators. He also happens to be an expert on Broadway musicals. Mark writes for the National Review in the US, and he appears regularly on the Rush Limbaugh Show. He's got a new book. It's got a very cheery title, After America, Get Ready for Armageddon. He says part of the problem is that America is now governed by a political class whose members have been to Yale and Harvard. They possess high IQs, multiple degrees, but most of them have never actually run anything. And he says the first couple over there are a par excellence example of this new class. So I began our conversation by asking Mark what it is about Barack Obama that makes him different.
Yes, I think if you compare him with previous Democratic presidents, with Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter, even his own vice president, Joe Biden, they're conventional Democratic Party figures. You can disagree with them. I certainly disagreed with all those three figures, but you recognize that they are products of the Democratic contribution to mainstream American political culture. Barack Obama seems to me to be someone who was created by and elected by a broader culture outside of Democratic Party politics. He's been marinated his entire adult life in a kind of faculty lounge view of America and of American power in the world. And I think that kind of citoyen du monde aspect of him makes him a very different figure from previous Democratic presidents. In that sense, when you watch him addressing the world in his Berlin speech, you see someone who I think at a certain level is disconnected from the rhythms of American life in a way that Bill Clinton certainly wasn't.
It is a bit odd, isn't it? He's often called the smartest guy to become president, and yet it's hard to point to, an original idea or even any action of substance that he's been involved with.
Yeah, I think a lot of that is how we define smarts. This administration is nominally a smart administration, the smartest administration of all time. David Brooks of the New York Times basically hailed them as that when they came in. They're all Ivy League guys. A lot of them have advanced degrees. There's heavy representation from Harvard and Yale. David Brooks said if the enemy happens to strike during the Harvard-Yale game, we're screwed, because all these loyal Harvard-Yale alumni would all be at the game instead of being back in Washington minding the store. But we're screwed anyway. I mean, that's what's so fascinating, is that the United States is $15 trillion in debt and getting more and borrowing $500 million every single hour of the day, and is sliding off a fiscal cliff. And yet we're run by, supposedly, the smartest people in history. Something's wrong about this, because back when we had Ronald Reagan from whatever it was called, Eureka College, Illinois, and we had Harry S. Truman, the haberdasher, and we had Abraham Lincoln, who only had 18 months of formal education, and Andrew Jackson, who never went to school at all. Oddly enough, a lot of these problems didn't seem to exist, and then the smart guys took over, and we're heading for the cliff edge.
Let's just stick with the smart people for a moment before we talk more about America. Can you tell us a little about the trajectory of Michelle Obama and her time at Princeton?
Yes, it was very interesting. She's someone she's a beneficiary of what they call in America affirmative action. And that means to say that in order to address long-standing racial grievances and racial injustices, it was decided that there would be that affirmative action would, in effect, give credit to people for being from certain identity groups and fast-track them to college in order that people whose ostensibly their grandparents and great-grandparents had suffered from various forms of discrimination. Now, obviously, Michelle Obama didn't. She was born in the early 1960s. She's not even Condoleezza Rice's generation. She doesn't even have childhood memories of that. And it's amazing to me that she's got more sort of bitterness about being admitted to Princeton than people who don't get admitted to Princeton have. She said every step of the way, somebody was telling me what I couldn't do. I applied to Princeton. You can't go there. Your test scores aren't high enough, they told me. But I went anyway. Now, that's a fascinating complaint, because if she'd been applying to a university in China or a university in India and her test scores hadn't been high enough, that would have been, or even in France, that would have been the end of it. You know, you don't get extra credit for which particular identity group categories you happen to fall into. I mean, this is the postmodern education system in a nutshell. She arrives as a black woman at Princeton under the benefits of affirmative action, and immediately writes her undergraduate thesis on the difficulties of being a black woman at Princeton. But what fascinates me about that, Michael, is that she takes on this six-figure, college education. She and her husband each have about $1 million worth of college education between them, if you were buying it now. And then she takes this $1 million education and she becomes a diversity outreach consultant at the University of Chicago hospitals, getting $350,000 a year as a diversity outreach consultant, a job that was so necessary to the hospital that when she left to become First Lady, they didn't bother replacing her. And it would be fantastic if everybody in the Western world could live as a $350,000 diversity outreach consultant. But it's the diversion of spending six-figure sums on elite education and then training people to be diversity outreach consultants. That is a flawed business model that is a complete waste of the Western world's human capital.
But it works for some, doesn't it? I mean, there's an entire credential class, as you call them now. Who do they actually stand for? Who do they represent?
Well, I think in a strange way, they represent themselves. I think they're there to enforce conformity. I quote the British sociologist Lord Young, Michael Young, in the book, who's the man who invented the term meritocracy, and he invented it as a parodic term, as a satirical term for a vision of Britain in a sort of dystopian future. And it's always fascinating to me how many jokes are taken up and become real. So he invents this term meritocrat, and then suddenly an entire generation of politicians actually regards themselves as meritocrats. And Lord Young made what I thought was an interesting point, in that he thought these were actually, in the end, these guys were actually far more dangerous than an hereditary aristocracy or monarchy, that if you have somebody who just happens to be running the government because he was born an archduke, at a certain level he understands that the only reason he's getting to do that is a kind of accident of birth. Whereas when you have this super talented, self-reinforcing conformocrat bubble who all think alike, whether, some of them are white, some of them are black, some of them are straight, some of them are gay, for all the celebrating diversity on skin color and orientation and all the rest of it, there's no diversity in opinion. They're ruthlessly homogenized in that, and yet they think they deserve to rule. And that whiff, that kind of suffocating smugness, you could have a titanium-reinforced teleprompter in front of Barack Obama and you'd still get that, and that smugness would still be hitting you in the back row.
And it is odd, isn't it, as you pointed out, that the credential class, despite their own lack of experience, managed to sneer at someone like Sarah Palin, who, for all a lack of college higher education, can actually do things. Yes,
and I'm a great believer. I think we all, and I say this aware, that I'm a writer, and that is a relatively effete and lethargic profession. But one thing I always say when occasionally I'm asked for tips on writing, my advice to people is always don't just write there, do something. You should know how to shingle a roof. You should know how to raise sled dogs. You should know how to tap dance. You should actually be able to get out there and do something. George McGovern, who was the Democratic Party candidate 40 years ago, when he retired from politics, he did a sort of Bob Newhart thing. He bought a bed and breakfast in Vermont and started running it, and gave it up after a few years because he was horrified. He had no idea. This is a man who spent his entire life in politics, and he had no idea of how regulation cripples small business. And I think that's exactly. You can imagine if Barack Obama were ever forced into running a hardware store on Main Street in some no-account town in, Dead Moose Junction, Idaho, and he had to run a hardware store on Main Street, he too would be horrified. But we are now governed by a class of people who are entirely removed from that. There's a famous line, I think it was J.K. Galbraith, who I didn't agree with him on anything except this, but he grew up on his parents' farm in Ontario, and he said that if you've ever worked on a farm, nothing you do afterwards ever seems like real work again. And I think at one point you could be a great famous economist like Galbraith, and somewhere you would remember being 19 years old and working on a farm for a couple of summers. And that experience now from the American upper middle class, Barack Obama is a very good example of that. He looks like a man who's never broken a sweat in his life. And I think that's a big problem with this set.
For sure. Mark, let's talk about America more generally. And your last book, America Alone, was optimistic about America, at least when compared with most other places. But the new book, After America, is far more gloomy. What's changed?
Well, I think what's changed is that, and this is a tribute to how influential my book was, I basically said that most of the Western world, particularly Europe, had adopted this disastrous business model that was actually an existential threat to some of the oldest nation states on the planet. And my book proved so influential that America decided to sign up for the same program, supersized. And I think the difference is simply in the hard numbers, that if you look, for example, at just the annual deficit on the Medicare entitlement in America, that's about $38 billion every year. Now, that's bigger than the entire Greek deficit that is in danger of collapsing the entire Eurozone, we're told. So simply the hard numbers here. Barack Obama, he swans into Congress, gives a speech, airily proposing another $500 billion in government expenditure for this fiscal year. Now, no other country in the world, the trillion word, the T word, is unique to America. They're not talking about trillions in Greece or Portugal or Iceland or Australia. It's unique. That scale of spending is unique to America, and I think, it pains me to say so, but for that reason, I think the scale of disaster that America's at risk of is that much greater too.
Is this just about your politicians, or is it deeper than that? Is it about the entire country?
No, I don't think it's a bookkeeping issue. I disagree with friends on the right. Peter Ferreira, for example, just produced a very interesting book. He was a chap in the Reagan administration. He's just produced an interesting book trying to persuade his liberal friends that you can achieve liberal ends if you reform these programs. I don't think this is a bookkeeping issue. I think the reason why big government ostensibly is a waste of money, but I think its greater sin is that it's a waste of people. And in that sense, I think when you look at the guys on the rampaging through the streets of London a couple of weeks ago, trashing their own neighborhoods, I think that's actually part of the same problem, that you debauch your nation's finances, yes, but at a more profound level, I think big government debauches its human capital. And that's not something you should do idly, because there are no easy ways back from that.
Mark, I think it's time for a musical interlude. You remind us in After America that in 1961, President Kennedy said this to the American public. He said, "This nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth." Well, America did that, obviously, and one of the astronauts in 1969 took a song with him, an American song which we're about to play. Can you tell us about that song?
So I love this because it gets to the heart of American energy at its mid-20th century peak. If any other country had been the first to get to the moon, if it had been the Germans, they'd have got up there and they'd have played Beethoven, the Ode to Joy. If it had been Britain, they'd have probably played something by Elgar or Holst from the Planet Suite. The first American to stand on the moon got out his cassette machine and he pressed the button and he played Frank Sinatra with the Count Basie Band and a killer Quincy Jones arrangement.
Fly me to the moon, let me play among the stars.